Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the brand manager editorial of Skybound Entertainment. It's Morgan Perry. Thanks for coming on, Morgan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we're recording this at the end of the day on a Thursday, a very physically laborious day for you. How was the day in Skybound's offices?
It was good. I mean, when you have a couple of weeks between being in the office because you're at shows and, you get sick from said show, a lot of boxes show up at the office that you have to unpack and then reorganize. So it jettisoned me back into being in a comic shop again on a Tuesday afternoon, having to take care of the Tuesday shipment. So good little bit of nostalgia there, but I'm worn out.
I was trying to think of what an average day would be like for you because, it's like brand manager editorial sounds like a very specific role. But I imagine that while you're not normally emptying out boxes and spreading out inventory to make sure that you can share it with retail partners or whomever, I imagine a lot of times your job is kind of like expect the unexpected, if you will.
Yes, that is a really good way of describing it. The way I have described it to most people is what I do is I am like Doctor Strange and having to look into multiple different timelines to find out the best way in which we can kill Thanos and then the 99 million different ways in which we don't. So that's what I do.
So kill Thanos in this case would be get your comics in shops.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so before we get into the meat of the episode, I did want to lay some groundwork about who you are because, as we talked about before, not only do a lot of listeners likely not know who you are, they probably don't even know what exactly a brand manager editorial is or does. I'm not even entirely sure if I do. So let's start there. What is your role? Are you marketing? Are you editorial? Are you both? Like, what is your job exactly?
So what I do is, as the brand manager, is I am marketing, sales, a little bit of like publicity events, stuff like that. Like anything that is not physically like creating the comic or editing the comic is what we do on the brand team. We basically make sure that the comics get to the markets, whether that be direct market, book market, library market. So we're responsible for everything that you see in order to get the comics into shops.
Okay. I think it's the editorial word that always throws me off because I see that and I'm like, are you part of editorial?
So I am part of the editorial team. Technically, I am under that kind of like department within Skybound. Skybound is a multi-vertical content company. So we do TV, movies, gaming, tabletop, all of that stuff. There are brand managers for those specific teams. So that's why there's differentiation between what I do and specifically why it says editorial.
So it's like organizing by verticals rather than you're specifically editing comics or something.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And so your job, at least as far as what I can understand, sometimes means that you're editing trailers for the comics or putting storyboards together for the trailers for comics. Sometimes it means you're interacting with retailers. Sometimes it means you're inventorying stock. Sometimes it means you're going to cons, I imagine. So it really is like your mileage may vary, but just anything that involves getting people interested in Skybound's comics.
Yeah, so it's very granular sometimes because we put together all of the marketing plans and playbooks for all of our books. And a lot of that means like the very early groundwork for books from the time that a book is greenlit to final product. We also have a say in like variant cover programs as well that editorial puts together because we want to make sure that that's on brand for whatever IP that we're working on. We work with creators. I'm often doing sales presentations at shows. Sometimes you're just the like side stage manager at New York Comic Con, making sure that all the mics are in place and the presentation's ready to go. Like you just have to make sure that everything is good to go for everybody and that you're staying kind of like logistically on the road.
Well, and I imagine one thing that's interesting about your job, too, is for example, you have, let's say like Dark Ride. Like when Dark Ride #1 is coming out, you're thinking about that probably at least to some degree based off of the way the direct market works, where it's like 3 months out in terms of initial orders to like release. And then you have something like Clementine Book 2, which just came out. And in the book market, you're more thinking on what, like a 12-month scale?
Something like that. I mean, I would even argue that for like single issues, we're thinking 6 to 9 months out as well, because we're even thinking of this series at the green light stage. And so what goes into making sure that that gets solicited into previews correctly? So that's like, do we have all of our covers in on time? Do we have that solicit text? So sometimes that extends beyond the initial window. And we're working with the other teams as well, like our social team and our press team, to make sure that like they're hitting the announcements, they're hitting pre-marketing, all of that different stuff well ahead of the initial order stage, so that we are ready to go and hit the ground running once the book hits previews or the lunar catalog. But yeah, you're right. With graphic novels, it's definitely 9 to 12 months out. from the release date of the book.
Because that's normally how like librarians and like booksellers operate, is like they're in their consideration window that far out.
Yeah, because they're mostly placing their initial orders or initial laydown like about 6 months before the book comes out. And that can also differentiate between whether or not the book is printed, domestically or overseas as well, because it takes an additional amount of time if you're printing overseas versus printing domestically. So that could extend your timeline even more.
Oh my God.
I know.
That's one of the things that I think is really interesting about the kind of the brand and marketing side of comics is that, I know a lot of times that people pick on the marketing side because they're like, how hard can it be to sell these comics? And the thing is there's all kinds of factors, including just how those different spaces operate and how you have to like work with initial announcement and then initial orders and then final order cutoff and then release. So like those are distinct windows you have to promote comics. And you have to have plans for each of them, which is probably part of the reason why you have to plan out 6 to 9 months for a 3-month window.
Yeah, and then we're also simultaneously at that same time, especially if the book is released in single issues first, we're also planning all of the pre-marketing and on sale and sell through for the collected version of that as well. So there's like a little bit of overlap as well. And it's just like I said, Doctor Strange, you're looking at multiple different timelines. Multiverse.
Transformers 1 just came out. God, was it late or early October, or was it
October 4th?
October 4th. Okay, so it just came out early October. Are you already thinking about the trade?
We're literally putting together all of our stuff for, book distribution. That's already been done.
God, you really are. It's like you're operating in all these different like time wavelengths at one time. It is pretty wild. So you mentioned this earlier, the distinctions between like, brand manager, editorial, et cetera, et cetera. Skybound has a bunch of different product lines. So that means you do not touch those other ones. You're just comics.
Correct. For the most part, I operate distinctly in the comics publishing editorial space. That doesn't mean that there's not overlap with other teams and other brand managers, but anything that is within the comic space is our directive.
Okay. It is interesting because I think sometimes, like if you come from a comic perspective, you think of Skybound and you think of like, oh, Walking Dead and Invincible, of course. Of course, if you think of TV shows, you probably think, oh, Walking Dead and Invincible, of course. But at the same time, like there's all those different games and all the different, like there's like picture books. There's all kinds of different products that Skybound is working on that are big parts of the company too, that I don't think a lot of people really think about.
Yeah. And when I say that there's overlap, like we do genuinely work like together as a team. So whenever there is an opportunity for a book to come out, like all of the teams get our pre-marketing promotional plans and playbooks to take a look at and see if there's anything that they can pull from that as well. So that's why you'll sometimes see like tabletop games like No Context for Mr. Levinstein, which was Mr. Levinstein Presents Feelings, which is a web comic book that we put together. But our tabletop team was like, this is really cool. I think we could make a game out of this. And we're like, go for it. And like that just works for the creators because Skybound has this thing called the Wheel of Awesome. So whenever you bring in something, a new IP, there are all these different opportunities for that creator to have their creation go in different directions. So, it benefits them that we have a whole team that's dedicated to like mass media and TV and film and games and tabletop and all of this other crazy podcasts, like all of this crazy stuff.
I did a feature about Skybound for the 10th anniversary, and it was really funny learning about the Wheel of Awesome, because I think that if you didn't know any better, it might sound like this really unserious thing.
Yeah.
It is like an actual important guide to everything that Skybound does, even though it's called the Wheel of Awesome, which just sounds like a joke, but it's totally true.
Mm-hmm. And all of the teams are engaged in different ways, which is really cool. We're all trying to work towards the shared goal of just making cool shit, which like that's all we want to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think that's awesome that you've got a whole group of people dedicated to just making cool stuff happen.
That's great. Well, before we get further into what you do, I wanted to talk a bit about your background because I think it's very instructive about how you ended up in the role you're in. I only want to do part of your background because you got a lot. You have a shockingly robust background. But I wanted to start at the beginning. I want to start with the most consequential comic of your life, which was apparently an issue of Shonen Jump you found at a Walgreens. Which,
yes.
I didn't even know Walgreens had Shonen Jump, which is just very funny. But that introduced you both to manga and serialized comics and set you on a path to wanting to become a comic artist yourself. What was it about that issue that was so impactful to you in your life? Because it is kind of like point zero for all of this.
Yeah, so I think it's twofold. The first part is I was the weird Yu-Gi-Oh kid at that time. So like it was Yugi on the cover and I was like, "Yes, I want that, Mom." And so I picked it up and at the same time like I liked writing stories and I liked drawing things. And this is I'm like 8 or 9 years old. So I'm not doing anything serious. It's not really like clicking in my brain that comics is a career. And I'm reading the book and it's like, "Oh, there was like a click that happened where I was like, you can write the story and draw the story and you can create comic books." And then I read the chapter and finished the chapter of Yu-Gi-Oh! And then it went to like One Piece or something. And I had this moment of what the hell? Where's the rest of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Story? I don't understand this. And finally understanding like, oh, this is at the time I didn't know it was called serialized comics, but it was part of the subscription-based monthly releases that they were planning on doing with Viz and Shonen Jump. And so I was like, oh, if I want to get the next story, I have to buy the next issue next month. It was seeing that you could create these entire worlds and tell a story and have sequential art be a thing that set me on the path of like, I want to do this as my career. I don't know if that's actually a thing. And then several years go by, and that's how when I was doing my college kind of like search and stuff, I found Savannah College of Art and Design. They were one of the like 3 schools at the time that were offering anything comics related. And I think I was like a sophomore in high school. And I was like, all right, the goal is SCAD. We're going to get there. We're going to go and we're going to go make comics. So like I did my final like high school art thesis on comics. I did all of my like final projects as comics, got in, did the whole like portfolio review, all of that stuff, had to be like completely trained in traditional art as well, and then be able to be more specialized in sequential.
So you went down that path. You went to school for sequential art. Like, what led you away from making your own art as like your career path?
The need to pay rent. I live in LA, so like rent's expensive.
That's a super legit answer.
But yeah, I mean, like I was at the time, like I'll fast forward, but like I was working in a comic shop at the time and I was working on my own comics between, folks coming in and after hours and stuff. And it got to a point where I was like, well, I had the opportunity to interview with Boom Studios for a direct market representative position. I had interned with them before doing marketing with them to kind of learn the back end to help my own comics career, to figure out like, well, what does a publisher look for? It kind of snowballed from there. Like I got the job and now I have a full-time job with healthcare and benefits, and I don't necessarily have to do my comics, and I don't necessarily have to like hustle as hard to make the bread as it were.
Do you still draw?
Not as frequently. I doodle on occasion. I had a lot. I'll be completely honest. I had a pretty bad health scare earlier this year, as well as some kind of like mental health stuff, like depression. Mm-hmm. So like that kind of took me away from drawing. But I get to pursue it now as like a hobby. So that's really fun, and I get to kind of like explore things. And I've actually learned a lot being on this side of the business, which I think has improved my own art as well. I'm not thinking so hard on like, oh, I need to make this book to be able to sell it, to be able to live.
Yeah.
I can just do things for fun.
Yeah, I mean, you can just do it for passion. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Really quick, I want to go back to the Yu-Gi-Oh of it all because I think it's kind of funny. How did you know Yu-Gi-Oh at that point?
Just the cartoon, the anime that was playing on like WB, the really bad 4Kids version.
Yeah.
And like the card game, and I played the card game, but I didn't know that it was based off a comic. And so that was kind of the start.
So that's like one of the funny things. And I think this is like kind of I don't know if this is a marketing insight, but it is kind of interesting. I'm part of the generation that grew up on like the animated series for like X-Men and Batman and everything like that. But the thing that actually really got me into reading comics was I love sports cards. Mm-hmm. And there was an issue of Uncanny X-Men that had a trading card. It was polybagged and it had a trading card, and I wanted that card. And the only way to do it was to buy that comic, and I got the comic. And I don't remember whatever happened to the card. I don't even remember who was on the card. I think it was Gambit, I want to say.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Bruno at Big Bang's going to be so mad at you.
Yes, he will be. Yes. I ended up reading the comic, and I loved it. And like that was the comic that really kind of set my path to doing it. And it is kind of funny. This ties into like part of the reason why manga is so huge today is because like anime has been driving a lot of people to it. And I think it's funny how much those other manifestations of these, Yu-Gi-Oh or X-Men or Invincible or whatever eventually drives people to read the comics too.
Yeah, accessibility is key. And I think, you and I are from the generation that kind of had to struggle to get our accessibility because if you missed, that key episode on Toonami, you'd have to wait until 3 a.m.
Yeah.
to watch it and you wouldn't be able to hopefully catch it ever again. But like now you have Crunchyroll, you had Funimation at a point before they got assimilated into Crunchyroll. You have High Dive, you have Hulu, you have Netflix, you have all these different verticals of entertainment and streaming that just make these shows so accessible. And then we have so much opportunity as booksellers to be able to be like, okay, but if you liked the show and you want to get ahead of it, or you like this content and you want to read more, see like how it's changed, here's the printed version.
Yeah.
Here's the book that it's based on.
Well, it's funny. My wife is a big anime watcher, and she watched all of Bleach. And like, I don't know if you've ever watched Bleach, but basically, yes. I would say, I don't want to say like half of every episode, but it always feels like a part of the previous episode is in the episode you're watching. And it just has this endless cycle like that. And she was just watching Jujutsu Kaisen, and she was like, this show is awesome, at least in part because they stopped doing that. Yeah. And I kind of wonder if it's at least in part because it's newer and you don't have to have that, like, any episode could be somebody's first episode thing because people are just binging it on Crunchyroll or whatever.
Yeah, I think also, I don't know if this is correct, but I think part of the Japanese animation industry at the time is that was meant to save like animation and budget.
Oh, sure.
And also because the way that Japanese animation works is like basically they're working on the animation and the final version to deliver to the networks, like sometimes within hours of it airing. So like it's ridiculous like how close to the wire they are on some of this stuff. So I think a lot of it was to save time. But I love the fact that we don't have that anymore. Like Jujutsu Kaisen doesn't do that. Chainsaw Man didn't do that. Like maybe you get like a 2-minute like recap of like just those last couple lines to get us back where we are if it's been a week. But I love it. I dig it. So much fun.
My Hero Academia did do that. My wife was just watching that, and it was really funny because she'd just be like, why is it showing the first, like the last 10 minutes of the last episode? I'm like, it's what it does. I don't know. Anyways, we go down this path forever. I did want to talk about one thing before you get to Boom. You worked at Earth 2 in Los Angeles. That was, you were an assistant manager there amongst other roles, and you did a little bit of everything. How formative was that time for the career you ended up taking on? Because you mentioned doing your stuff today at Skybound was like taking you back to working at a shop. Was that hugely formative to kind of where you went at Boom and now Skybound?
I think so, yeah, because what was interesting about working at Earth 2 is that I kind of had the freedom to do whatever I wanted in the store. And so it was things like merchandising and working in customer service, which I had done before previously. But I think where I really got into it was the general manager there, Chris Kohler. He and I connected really like instantly on like the nitty gritty of retail, making sure that like the racks are clean, it looks good, it's merchandised correctly, are the racks organized, like all of that stuff. And I was like, teach me everything. And he was like, you actually want to know? And I was like, yes, I want to know. And then that got into like, how does previews work? What's FOC? Like I'm taking in these catalogs from folks, like, and I'm inputting all of their orders. Like, what does that actually mean? And so learning that process from the back end was super formative. And then also just being in a shop every single day to be able to like recommend comics to people that I enjoyed and watch them like get excited about it and come back and put it on their poll. And then, folks who didn't know about previews, teaching them about previews and being like, oh, you can actually, order this book from this publisher that is really small and independent, but you love this book, and we'll make sure that you have a copy so you're not freaking out that you've lost issue 3 or you've missed out. That was a lot of fun for me. I can't really explain it because people are like, what, you really liked retail? And I was like, yes, absolutely, it was so much fun.
I've always wanted to do like I don't know, maybe this would just be like a volunteer thing. I guess I could just do this now anyways, but I've always thought it'd be fun to just be at a shop on Wednesdays and just stand around and like, if anyone has any questions, just be the person where like, ask that person and like help them find the things that they would be interested in, because it's a very, especially today, there's a huge amount of comics, and trying to find the comic for you from a sea of books can be really difficult. I imagine that's a big part of it too, is like you maybe started to understand what motivates people as to what they're looking for and how you can guide them in that direction.
Yeah, and you get a really good sense of your customers as well. So like you're seeing what they're putting in their pull box every week. You see what they're bringing up to the counter every week. And then you can kind of, stitch together new books and be like, oh, hey, I saw that you really liked, Paper Girls. Why don't you try this series? This is new from, DC or whatever, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, cool." And then you start to build this trust with them because they start to acknowledge that like you have taste, and they're like, "Oh, I can actually trust you and your thoughts on comics." And then that leads them to trying different things. And it also makes the store really unique because then it's influenced by the employees that are there and what the employees like because they're hand selling different things than another store. So you may have a store down the street or another part of the city that's like heavily Marvel and DC focused, but your shop is mostly indies, and so that's where your crowd goes. And yeah, I mean, like being in a shop on Wednesday is a magical thing, especially if you have that late night shift. It's wonderful. And I miss being caught up on everything. That's the one thing I do miss.
It's tough. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Do you wish that buying and reading digital comics was even easier? Well, I have good news. Omnibus is here for you. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses, all day and date. They're pay per book, just like your LCS, but digital, so you're already used to the experience. Their focus is on building an excellent customer shopping and reading experience and using novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book. They feature top-tier content and already have many of the top publishers in comics today on board. Want to find the right digital comic shop for you? Download Omnibus today on the Apple App Store to do just that. And now, back to the show. I imagine that skill and like kind of knowing what motivates people and how you can guide people to things. I imagine that to some degree is translatable to your current role and also your role at Boom in the sense that that's you doing it on a micro scale. And when you're talking to retailers, it's doing it on a macro scale.
Yeah, exactly. It was, that's kind of how I described it to folks was I got to basically do the comic shop experience for worldwide retailers, but it's also like very specifically to one publisher. And then, you know, if you're just a fan of comics, then the retailers will come to you too and being like, "Can you help me with my manga section?" I'm like, "Sure, absolutely, let's go."
So somebody would reach out to you and just be like, "What do I need to stock?" Or what is it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I get texts and DMs from retailers a lot that's like, "Hey, I'm trying to build out my manga section. What are some of the books that you recommend that I pick up?" I got an email recently where it was like, "We're trying to build out our manga section beyond like the popular stuff." And I was like, "Well, what sells the most in your store? Like not just manga wise." And they're like, "Oh, we do really well with horror." I was like, "Well, you clearly already have Junji Ito. So like, here's a list of horror books from different publishers and like the distributors that they're from so that you can grab them and they're really good." And then also keeping an eye out on new series that are coming out of Japan and being like, "Well, who's going to pick this up?" And then if somebody does, which is super exciting, being like, "Hey, retailers, you should be on the lookout for this in previews," because the way that manga is solicited in the Diamonds previews, it's hard to order and reorder. So folks miss it. And so you know, Barnes and Noble has way more capital to spend on that. And they're placing their orders super far in advance compared to retailers, especially with FOC and books. So if they can have the heads up and I'm the person that can be like, "Yo, check out this series, Smoking Behind the Supermarket with You is going to be real big from Square Enix. This is what you should be grabbing." Or like, "I'm pretty sure this is going to get an anime in 6 months with Kaiju number 8. And then of course, 6 months later, they announce an anime and I'm like, "I told you."
It's funny. That stuff is not part of your job.
No.
But at the same time, in an interesting way, it kind of tying back into the retail experience. It's kind of like what you were saying about making people trust you. Not that you were doing it for a cynical reason. You just want to help out people. But at the same time, it's like if they trust your taste and your ability to know what works, when you go back to them and say, "Hey, Duke is looking awesome," it's a little bit easier to sell them Duke probably.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, like that's trust built over a number of years, and like you don't always hit the mark on it, and sometimes you're going to be wrong, or sometimes it didn't really work out. But like you start to get a sense of like what each store is really good at selling. Like I know WWE was an interesting one from Boom because like some stores did really well with WWE because they were in a big WWE focused area, and then other stores were like, "I can't sell this at all."
Yeah,
and I was like, "Okay, well, it's not for you. Let's try and find a series that's for you." At the end of the day, like I just love readership, and I just want people to be reading comics. And I don't care what comic that is, whether it's Skybound or Boom or manga or what. I'm like, just read.
That's one of the things I think is interesting about you is I always appreciate when you do those threads on Twitter or X or whatever the hell you want to call it, where it seems like you are interested in being an evangelist about the good or effect of things anyone does in comics, like sharing stories or news you find to be, like you shared my Vault story about like how they're
Yeah.
giving away Unnatural Order #1, and you offer insight into the process, and you do that regardless of publisher, which a lot of times some people don't want to do because, crossing company lines or doing this or doing that. I like that you do that because, I don't know, there's a lot of good things that happen. And to be honest, if it's something that's going to motivate people to go into a comic shop or try out comics, then that's something that benefits you or benefits you in Skybound. And so why not support it?
Absolutely. It's so funny because like I'm not sharing anything that's like proprietary information for companies or whatever. Everything that I say is public information that you can check out on like Comic-Con or ICV2 or are just like evaluations or opinions or observations from myself. So I'm not crossing any company lines. But I think, if Vault's doing well with a book and that's something that we can comp to later on a Skybound book, that only helps us in the long run. Same thing with like if a Skybound book is doing really well and that's a good comp for somebody at another company to use, then that helps them sell more books. That helps build readership across everything. And I just like I said, I just want people to read comics. And I want people to do well. I want people to sell a lot of books. And, yeah. I don't know.
This is a thing that you brought up. There was that whole meme from Tangled where like what is the thing that makes your comics opinion that makes people hold swords up to the guy's like neck or whatever.
Yeah.
And like your one was it was about comics and manga. And I think it's interesting how so often that people kind of set up like manga and anime as like combative with like Western comics, where it's like, oh look, like they're mopping the floor with them, and I'm like, well, retailers are selling a lot of manga, so they're pretty happy about the fact manga's doing well too, and it brings people into their shops, which means that they could sell them other things too. It's interesting how so often this stuff can be like set up as combative when it's all comics, right?
Yeah, it's all comics. And I think what's interesting now, I mean, like maybe the party lines were a little like stronger a couple years ago when just manga fans kind of felt, excluded from general comics readers. But now, like, you have a whole generation of readers that are reading things off of Webtoon. They're, reading comics off their phone. Web comics are on Instagram and all of that cool stuff. Like, they are introduced to sequential art so early, and they fall in love with these characters, whether it be from social media or from animations or TV shows. And it doesn't matter what country or like what type of publication the book comes from, whether it be North American, Japanese, or bande dessinées from France. Like, they just want to read the book. They just want good stories. They just want characters and to be part of something. And I think we're seeing those lines blur up a little bit. Like, comic shops are a little late to the party when it comes to selling manga because of everything that happened in the aughts and like the rise and fall of like Tokyo Pop and all of that stuff. But we're seeing the resurgence come back, especially with that accessibility with Crunchyroll and High Dive and having anime on Netflix. It really does help raise the tide and help them stay informed and build out another vertical within their store that isn't necessarily like Funko Pops or action figures. It's another form of reading to where they can kind of more operate like a bookstore.
Especially when they're asking you for the latest hot thing. Just a couple of questions on Boom before we fully get into Skybound.
Sure.
So your job, you were there in varying capacities for about 5 years, and you did everything from running the Boom Guarantee Retailer Rewards Program to helping retailers with basically anything and everything they might need, which I imagine depended on the moment. That was your first full-time job at a comics publisher, even though you interned there. Was there a learning curve to that, or did you find that thanks to having been an intern and having worked at Earth 2, that it was a pretty easy transition?
I think in terms of the people, like there were still a lot of folks that were still at Boom that were there when I had my internship. They were like, "Oh, it's you again," and I was just like, "Hey, what's up?" So that was really cool, and that kind of made it not seem like new person. I kind of already had like friends there or colleagues there, which made that transition easier. Also, ironically enough, Arun Singh, who is my boss now at Skybound, was my boss at Boom as well, and he was the one that hired me. And he and I met at Earth 2 when his jaw was wired shut, and I was giving him recommendations for cat comics for his wife.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so like we run deep on that relationship. So that made it really easy. But in terms of like experience, yeah, there was a learning curve because it's a corporate job. And so there was like different rules and guidelines, and they already had like a set system of how they liked things to be done. And so I had to kind of like sit for a minute and like learn how they did things. And then I was like, well, how can I put my own spin on this to where it's unique, and then maybe we can change the mold on how we approach these different things. Like at first, I think like their FOC newsletter was only like 3 key points that you need to know about this week's FOC, and I was like, that's not enough space. Like, so I did the 3 key points for a little bit, and then I was like, hey Philip, can we change this? And he was like, yeah, go for it. And I was like, okay. And I think a lot of that changed at Comics Pro too, because like the first event I did was Comics Pro in Memphis. And I met Patrick from Challengers. It was the first retailer I met because I think he was introducing the keynote speaker, which happened to be Ross that year. And then I met Jermaine from Acme Comics as well. He was the second retailer I met. And then I think having the cachet of being Carr's assistant manager also helped, because they're like, oh, Carr was like a founding member of Comics Pro. Of course, yeah, if you're one of his people, you're good. And so like that eased the transition. But I think in terms of like actually doing the work, there's always a bit of a learning curve with a corporate job, and learning how to do corporate speak. One of my biggest challenges was like communication, because like I couldn't just be, blunt and be myself. I had to like figure out how to communicate with different people and different egos and different needs. So that definitely took time.
I imagine that there was a broad spectrum to how much you could be yourself to some degree, especially when you go to something like Comics Pro, where it's like, you talk to Patrick, anybody, like Patrick Breyer from Challengers Comics and Conversation, you can be yourself because it's Patrick. Patrick would hope and expect for that. But like with other people, it's like you don't know. It's like you could meet some random retailer that you don't know, and you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward because you're representing Boom and yourself. I do think it's interesting, though. I'm not going to put this on you, but it was funny that your 5 years basically completely coincided with Boom's like escalation from like a rising publisher to like firmly the number 4 at the very least in the direct market. And it is interesting where the Boom I remember when the Boom Guarantee program came out. Once in Future was the first one for that, right?
No, Boom Guarantee program was about 2 years before Once in Future, because I think Once in Future came out 2018, 2019, something like that. I forget what titles were first on the Boom Guarantee program, but like it was things like Met Cadet U and Dodge City, things that were coming out well before that. But Once in Future, I think, is kind of where the meteoric rise of Boom started.
Right.
Because we announced at that Comics Pro that it was only going to be one cover. It was going to be fully returnable. We were also going to make like issues 2, 3, 4, and 5 fully returnable as well. Like it was like the whole first arc was going to be returnable, and then the series got extended, and so it was like, well, we can't do that anymore. We can't go all the way to 12.
Issue 30 fully returnable.
And well, I mean, sometimes we would do that. Like we would, find different ways that we could do that, especially with like Sick Tick. Or, sorry, Something's Killing the Children. That's what I always do with that book. I always go back to the acronyms.
Wait, I always say Sick-C in my head. You do Sick Tick?
Sick Tick.
Yeah, I guess that would be right, wouldn't it? I don't know. It's funny. I guess I've never said that out loud. I've just typed it.
Yeah, I don't know how other people were saying it, but like when I would type it out, I would say Sick Tick. And then like when I was talking to people, it would be like Sick Tick, Sick Tick, Sick Tick. And it was like, okay. So that kind of became the internal moniker for that book. It was the only one that we could do and say it with, because like we only find them when they're dead was like waffle or something like that. We're like, no, that doesn't make sense.
I like it though.
But we would have to like condense that title down to like the first letters of each words too. So that was kind of how we communicated about those titles internally, which was fun. Yeah, I mean, it started with Once in Future. To be honest, like that Comics Pro was huge for Boom.
I remember.
It was nuts.
Philip had that the keynote speech. Philip Sablik from Boom had that keynote speech, and it was all about basically Once in Future and like how you're putting all of your weight behind this. And it was interesting because kind of that stretch, and then like Sick Tick, Something is Killing the Children came after that, and then it was Berserker hit, and then it was just like everything was really escalating. I guess like, did you find that stretch helped you get a much better understanding of what it takes to really move the needle in the direct market in particular?
I think yes and no, because I think it was like different. Because then you also have to put the pandemic in there too, with some of the stuff that happened in the retail space that really helped those books like blow out of the water in terms of like retailer exclusives and how many retailer exclusives were on those books at those different times. And like when Sick Tick actually did start to like really take off, I think it was around like issue 8 or 9, which was like solidly in the pandemic.
I remember when like the 7th printing came out and it was like a foil or something like that, and the people at my shop were like drooling from the mouth like, I need this. And I'm just like, a 7th printing? Are we talking about the same thing?
So the local comic shop foil edition of Something's Killing the Children. I'm sorry, that was me. Um, and then also the eighth printing that was tied to Berserker #2 orders.
Yes, I
That
remember
was
that.
me as well. And that was just me sitting in a meeting with Philip. And I hope that if he's listening to this, I'm like, I'm sorry, Philip, I'm gonna pull back the curtain on this. Is like we were talking about it, like what do we do to like help Berserker kind of like maintain attrition, because like that really becomes the key node of data that you're working on. It's not necessarily the launch numbers. It's like what's the attrition from 1 to 2 and then 2 to 3, which is probably the most important. And they wanted to do this big promotion with, if you bought issue 2 of Berserker, you would get the special variant. And at first it was going to be like another variant for Berserker #1. And I remember being in that meeting and I was like, why don't we just do Sick Tick, like an 8th printing of Sick Tick? And he would like, I saw his eyes just go. And like the what? And it ended up working and it was fun and people chased after that variant, which was cool. But you know, it's just one of those like one-liners of like, well, what if we did this? We're overcomplicating it. And I think that's what I learned a lot is like, don't overcomplicate it.
Yeah.
Keep it incredibly simple for retailers because it makes it easier for them to order your book if they're not, you know, having to do math or having to like connect the dots and the red strings and be like the Pepe Sylvia meme from It's Always Sunny. And, you know, it keeps it simple for you too, because then you have a repeatable process that you can kind of run the playbook back on. So that's why things like Once and Future worked and then Something's Killing the Children worked and then Berserker works. It's because you just saw the same tactics being used, but adjusted to that specific brand's needs.
It's pretty smart. I also like the fact that your impersonation of Philip sounded almost exactly like Little John in my head. So now I just think that that's how Philip is when he's not on podcasts with me. He just sounds like Little John.
No comment.
Yeah. So you started at Skybound as the brand manager editorial in early 2022. Was the big draw for you Arun, or was there something about what Skybound was up to that really intrigued you?
Skybound was launching Skybound Comet at the time. Like I had heard the rumblings of Skybound Comet. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, you're gonna put Tilly Walden on The Walking Dead? Like that's gangbusters. Like that's money right there. Like give me that book right now. And I thought that was really interesting that they were one of the few publishers that were in the North American traditional comics publishing market that were doing graphic novels, like straight up graphic novels for middle grade and YA, because a lot of publishers seem to chop them up into single issues first to see if the people will like the story and then move forward. And like that can really ruin the pacing of a book. You know, a lot of publishers do that to spend money on the collected edition later. Like it helps them kind of like cushion out the later iterations of the book. And Skybound wasn't doing that. And I was like, oh, that's risky. But also, like, you're clearly making smart talent choices and smart creative choices because they had Everyday Hero Machine Boy announced. They had Sea Serpent's Heir with Margaret Scott and Pablo Tunica. And then, of course, they ended up having Ava's Demon and like Scurry later, and these like really interesting properties and making really interesting creative choices. I was like, oh, okay. So that was a big draw. I also really liked how they did not do a lot of variant covers at the time, because like every single book that you would look at Skybound, it was always trade dressed, almost always open to order. They very rarely did incentives. And I was like, that's a really interesting model. And I think it was Robert Kirkman who said, he was like, I had heard that he had said like, well, I want people to know like what the book is regardless of what cover it's on. So the title always has to be on the book. And I was like, keep it simple. And so it was very a keep it simple attitude. And yeah, I wouldn't be lying either if I didn't say like, I had worked with Arun before, so I knew what that relationship would be as well. And it would be a different working relationship because I actually worked under Spencer Simpson, who was formerly at DC, now at Oni, when he was the sales manager over at Boom and then sales director. So it was an interesting opportunity. And then it was also mixing in marketing experience, which I had never really done before at Boom. Like I worked with the marketing team at Boom, but I was not necessarily in charge of that type of branding. I was mostly focused on the sales and the numbers and, you know, being that voice of like, you should buy this. You should stock it in your store. It's really great. So it was an interesting opportunity to grow my skill set and see like what other opportunities are out there in comics and like, how can I push the boundaries of my own limitations in how I operate in this narrative and how I move my own path forward. And Skybound, you know, offered that opportunity and I was like, heck yeah, let's go.
When you were with Boom, you and as a retail lead in a variety of other roles, you were mostly engaging with retailers. And now it's like you have an expansion of your roles where you're doing a little bit of everything on the marketing and retail side.
Yeah, so at Skybound, I'm working with the retailers and I'm working with booksellers and I'm working with librarians like I did at Boom. But I'm
Hmm.
also working with folks that work for like School Library Journal and Publishers Weekly, and then external partnership opportunities, working more closely with licensors in regards to how things get marketed, working with different teams and how those plans are set up, working directly with talent on certain, aspects of their book, whether that be, events, virtual or in person, or getting them set up with our press team for interviews, or making sure they arrive at Midtown for their signing on time at New York Comic Con, like all that kinds of stuff.
That one sounds pretty particular.
No, it's just like wild to me that like, that's part of my job is like being at Midtown early to be like, is everybody gonna get here?
Come on, Josh, where you at, man? We need you to sign. Get here.
He was on time. They were all on time.
Okay, good. I don't want to slander Joshua Williamson and his lack of
wonderful.
punctuality. Yes, he is.
No, he's wonderful.
I do think it's kind of interesting. Like we talked in the beginning about like the different time frames and like between the book market and the direct market and everything like that. But that is one thing I think is interesting about Skybound is with the Wheel of Awesome and with all of like the different product lines and how there could be connectivity between those, and also things like Comet, where you're getting to work with YA and with middle grade and everything like that. It does seem like there's a lot more variability and a lot more. I mean, not to make it seem like your job at Boom was simple, but there's a lot of new things and new inputs and new things that you have to learn in that job that would probably make it kind of exciting and different every day.
Yeah, I would say so, especially like you can't do the same things with the IP for like comics that you would be able to do for like TV and film. But there are certain guidelines that about TV and film that you should include when you're doing, your book market publishing, or if this is like a potential option, it becomes a selling point. So it's like a rhombus is a square, but a square is not a rhombus situation most of the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's real interesting stuff.
I do want to say I'm very fond of Skybound Comet. Like the first wave, I was very fond of Everyday Hero Machine Boy. I think
love Everyday Hero Machine Boy.
It's so good.
It's so good.
Was it Treve Wong who did the art? I mean, it's
Treve Wong.
Just unbelievable art. And I'm a very big fan. I mean, the funny thing is this is like, I don't know what this says about me, but I remember where I was when I think I got an email from Sean Makowitz telling me ahead of time that Tilly was doing Clementine, because he knew I was a massive Tilly fan and he knew that I was a massive Clementine fan. And so I remember that, and I was like in one of those weird hotel/malls in Las Vegas. And I was like, I told my wife, I was like, I gotta get better reception. I saw an email come in and I can't read it because I'm in this weird like Caesar's Palace type place. This is so weird. And I was like super jacked about it. I did want to ask about something very specific about Clementine though, because I just read the second book and it's awesome.
It break your heart?
Yeah, it did. And it's like, this, given the fact that before we started recording, I was talking about cats, unsurprisingly, I'm very, very supportive of Dr. Barnwell's ongoing like success in life relative to the situation. But the overall story was just unbelievable. But I read the second book and I went online and I was unsurprised to learn it was basically like being brigaded across every review platform you can find, because the people who are obsessed with that game do not like Tilly's take, which is insane to me because it's so good. When you're dealing with properties that have built-in audiences, whether that's something like the Transformers or G.I. Joe, or even something Skybound itself owns, like The Walking Dead, how much of the marketing job is finding the right way to engage with the fan base? Because that seems like it could be a challenge, especially on the Clem front, is like you want them to know about it, but you also don't want to like harm your own book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you have to view it from two different lenses. You have to view it in like, how is this book going to appeal to those fans, or at least a portion or percentage of those fans? Because you're not going to be able to make everyone happy. That is just the end of the day rule, is not everyone's going to be happy. And people are not going to like it, and people are going to be rude. But then you're going to have people that really do love it. And then you also have to look at it of like, well, who's going to like this that's a Tilly fan that may not be interested in The Walking Dead or may not have known about The Walking Dead? I know it's a 20-year-old property, but they may not have been introduced to Clementine through these games because they're not an avid gamer. How does this character, how can this character appeal to that audience? How can that Tilly's audience engage with this? Same thing with like even the Transformers stuff and G.I. Joe. It's like, well, how do we work with these fan bases that are very specific demographics of fan that have 40 years of collectible history. And how do we make them care about Daniel Warren Johnson's take on Transformers? And how do we make them care about, Joshua Williams' take on, Duke and Cobra Commander? And that's kind of my job, which is, okay, what are the cool things about this fandom and about this character that will draw those folks in? And then what are the cool things that I can tell them about this particular creator or creative team that's working on the book? So it's kind of a little bit of a marriage of both. But you do have to navigate, like if you're, entering a toxic fandom or something, you just have to kind of be aware of that when you're doing your marketing, or aware of that internally, so that you don't again, it's branding. It's like, oh, this is part of the brand, so we need to make that note internally to folks so that no one accidentally tags something that they're not supposed to tag, or says something they're not supposed to say in regards to the book. So you do have to keep that language very, not regimented, but like specific. And that's what my job is. And that's what our team's job is to do that. And that's like with all of our properties. It's like with Invincible, with The Walking Dead, with Transformers, with G.I. Joe, all of that stuff. Universal.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. We're heading into the end of the year, but the campaigns keep launching on Zoop. There's still time to support the legendary Howard Chaykin's campaign and descendant of Bram Stoker, Dacre Stoker's Tale of Dracula, and keeping it spooky as Ghosts from Cullen Bunn and Shannon Eric Denton. Finally, you do not want to miss out on the launch of an artisan edition book featuring John Buscema, Gil Kane, Barry Windsor-Smith, and other A-list artists. Head over to zoop.gg to support the live campaigns and sign up for the ones coming soon. It takes less than 30 seconds to create an account, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, every creator appreciates your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. It comes down to packaging it in the right format and packaging it in the right way for marketing so you can get it in front of the right people. I have to say, I was going to bring up the DC Compact Comics. I'm not going to do that, but I did want to give a quick shout because you guys were on that beat first. The Invincible Digest edition that came out in July is great. And it's funny because, my wife was watching some really weird Netflix movie that was super dramatic and involved, I think it was like School of Good and Evil or something like that. And I told her, she was describing to me, I was like, that is manga, or that is an anime. What are you talking about? Yeah. And then I was like, Invincible's kind of, it's not anime, but it's kind of not anime. And having it in that specific package makes a lot of sense. But the number one question that came up when I said you were coming on the podcast was talk about the Energon Universe, because that whole thing was really fascinating on a lot of different levels. But I think to start with, the Energon Universe, for listeners that don't know, is the new shared universe between Void Rivals, the comic from Robert Kirkman and Lorenzo De Felici, and the Transformers and G.I. Joe, two Hasbro properties, specifically Duke and Cobra Commander to start with. The thing that I thought was the most interesting and funniest about the whole thing was that there was rumors out that Skybound had the properties, and then just basically nothing for what was it, 6 months? 7 months?
At least a year.
Yeah, at least a year. Yeah. And I'm curious as to at what point into your run at Skybound did you find out it was coming together?
I knew before I was coming on board. That was one of the things that, they had alluded to. And they're like, we've got some really cool stuff coming down the road with licensing partners. I was like, oh, okay, cool. And then day one, I've already signed the paperwork, the NDAs, all that stuff. And they're like, oh, by the way, it's this. Because you had to start planning. We had to start thinking about it, at least in the back of our brains while we were doing everything else, because we knew that it was all kind of coming together in 2023, and we would be launching this book in June, or we'd be launching the shared universe in June. It's like, well, how do we do that? So our plans actually started probably...
So it's like a year and a half almost.
Yeah, Q4 of 2022 is when we really started seriously talking about okay, what does this look like in terms of marketing? And then, you get to closer and closer and closer to the FOC date for Void Rivals, which had to be solicited at the time, with no mention of Hasbro in any way, shape, or form. It was specifically solicited as a new Robert Kirkman series, which I thought was incredibly interesting and kind of a fun way to do it.
Not inaccurate.
It's not inaccurate because he did actually create a new IP for Hasbro. So it is kind of like a hybrid way of it.
Is Void Rivals technically a Hasbro property?
Yes, it is.
Oh, I had no idea. Interesting.
Yeah, so that was kind of the cool thing about it, was that Robert kind of got to create this new IP for Hasbro, which launched this universe and created something entirely new. I know that like our social team is putting out a bunch of these really cool behind the scenes video talks with Robert that he goes into that kind of more in depth, which is really cool. So check those out on our social. The interesting part of it was like, well, how do we make people care about this book? And, you know, we knew that there was going to be a Transformer at the end of the book, but we couldn't tell anybody that. And we couldn't tell anybody that we had these licenses because IDW was still running, you know, their publishing plans through the end of the year. So we wanted to be respectful of that and make sure that, you know, they had a really good closeout on their, you know, epic run with these IP before, you know, we did our own thing with it.
But you also didn't want retail partners to be completely unaware.
Exactly.
Part of the secretive nature of it was you had to, you know, be fair to your partner in Hasbro. But part of it seems like marketing, right? Like you had to like, if you set it up in the right way, it's going to get everybody really excited. I mean, was it a little bit of both?
I think so, because like, you know, most people are going to be excited about a new Robert Kirkman series, especially, you know, with the heat that he had on, you know, or has on Invincible with the animated show. So more people were checking out his, you know, backlist of titles, as well as the things that were still being published, like Firepower. And then, you know, we do have to be respectful of, you know, what Hasbro would want in that instance, as well as, you know, how do we set this book up best for success while, you know, being cognizant of all these different factors. And the key of it was like, well, at what point can we go ahead and just go, hey, retailers, Transformers at the end of the book? Like that was truly it. Jetfire. Yeah, exactly. Spoilers for anybody that has not read Void
Sorry,
Rivals.
all the jet heads out there are just super pissed at me now because they just found out. But I do think it's funny too, because it's like you rolled it out. At least from what I understand, basically the whole secret behind Void Rivals was told to select retailers about its connection to the universe and those Hasbro properties to help ensure they upped orders with confidence. Like, for example, like Jermaine Exum, you mentioned him earlier from Acme Comics. His shop is very oriented on Transformers, and you want to make sure that they know about that because they don't want to get like 10 copies of Void Rivals when they have all these fans that are going to be like, oh my God, Jetfire. So how did that all come together, and what made that the right play, at least from your perspective?
So we didn't do it with select retailers. We opened it up to every retailer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we legit, like, we sent out an email or several emails, as well as posted on, you know, retailer boards that we were a part of that were like, we're going to be doing a retailer call for Void Rivals with Robert Kirkman and Sean Makowitz. Come in, ask your questions about this new series. There's going to be big secrets revealed. And, you know, when retailers see like big secrets revealed, they're like, yeah, sure, whatever. And like we had, you know, we gave retailers the opportunity to sign up for this call. And it was a Zoom call. It was private. We recorded it, all of that stuff. We had a small amount of retailers show up, like at first, because we were like, oh, okay, cool. But we were recording it anyway. So if in case anybody couldn't make it, we would send them the recording anyway. But the full scale plan of this call was, hey, everybody, we're recording this. No sharing, blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, it's Transformers. That was the goal of like, let's just cut to the chase. And then like once Robert said that, we were like, keep the secret. We're telling you guys, we want to make sure that you guys order, you guys know, so you can order with confidence and be able to order appropriately for your store as well as, you know, your customer base, because we know that these IP have a long history in comic shops as well as with collectors. We know that, you know, dependent on however you were selling them beforehand, that may be different. We're doing new things with this. We're also doing a shared universe with Transformers, with G.I. Joe, but we're not going to tell you anything more than that because we're going to have other retailer calls if this goes really well. So please don't tell anybody or else we'll never do these again. Once retailers were like, it's a Transformer, and then like the chat just like went crazy with questions prior, and it was just like, okay, cool, people are engaged. And what ended up happening after that call, we completed it, we recorded it, we put it up, have it all password protected. Retailers started telling other retailers about the call, and they're like, yeah, you should email Skybound because, and also you didn't hear it from me, but there's something that's like really cool and you should know. And so we were getting emails from retailers like, I heard from a friend in a back alley that you've got some intel that I should know about this Void Rivals series. And we're like, yeah, sure. Here's the recording. Here's the password. Here's like the disclaimer of like, please don't tell anybody. Keep a secret. And we thought that this was going to like, we weren't sure like if it was going to be on Bleeding Cool in 24 hours or what. But surprisingly, like retailers self-police themselves to the point where like they got so angry when it actually did get broken on Bleeding Cool, like the Sunday before the book came out on sale, because people in Europe had gotten their copies and their shipments and like were opening the boxes and being like, oh, it's a Transformer at the end. And so that's how folks found out. But they were like, who told?
Yeah.
They're like ready with pitchforks.
That's the thing that really astonished me is it isn't the fact that you tried to make it a secret. It's the fact that you successfully kept it a secret for so long. I say this with love. Retailers have a tendency of wanting to talk. And I say that as a person who had received a message from a retailer that we both know about that being a thing before it went up there out on Bleeding Cool. And he was like, oh my God, Danny Warren Johnson. And I was just like, I'm not going to tell anyone, but you kind of ruined Void Rivals for me now.
That was the thing too. It was like, do you want to spoil issue 1 for people?
I was so excited when I actually got to the part where, again, spoilers for Void Rivals, when Jetfire is there, I would have been like instantly transported to like my childhood, like Anton Ego eating ratatouille and Ratatouille. It was like this moment where I was like, oh my God, all of a sudden I'm 6 again. Like Transformers was actually my gateway into comics originally, even before the trading card X-Men thing. But it is interesting because in a lot of ways, this stuff is not repeatable. I mean, I'm sure project to project, a lot of this stuff is not repeatable because you can't have a secret project coming together that has a connection to Transformers and G.I. Joe with every single project. But in a lot of ways, it is undeniable that the way you all rolled out the Energon Universe worked, both for you and for retailers. And to the point where, I mean, you just won an award at Comics Pro for, I forgot what it was. What was it, like Best Marketing Initiative or something like that?
Comics Pro Industry Award.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is an award that is nominated by Comics Pro or the retailers of Comics Pro it can be anybody in the publishing side. Usually it's on the back end of publishing. And it's for like achievements in the retail community or, you know, a massive respect, I guess. I don't know. I also won it when we were at Boom too, as part of that team at the Comics Pro, where Once and Future was like the big deal. Like that, we also won it there, which was really fun.
Wow.
So I've done it twice.
2 times.
2 times.
Knowing that all these things are not necessarily repeatable, like what do you think the big takeaways from its success should be? Like, what do you think other publishers should learn from its rollout?
Secrets don't help you sell books. And then they also do help you sell books if you tell them. You know, I think the biggest takeaway from this is that you can't, like you said, you can't do this with every single book. You can't do this. It's not super repeatable with every single title that you put out. So when you do it, you need to make sure that it's worth it. And like with Void Rivals, there's a Transformer at the end of the book. That is a huge deal. And that launch Hasbro at Skybound, that's a huge thing. And then, you know, in the Transformers call, we were like, okay, what are the big things from Transformers that we can tell people that will get them excited about this book? And is it going to be first issue stuff? Is it going to be 4, 5, 6 issue stuff? And then give them the opportunity to ask questions as well about like how this is going to work in their store. And we did the same thing with Void Rivals. They're like, what are the big overarching points that are going to get fans excited that we should tell retailers about, whether it's a first appearance or a creative team or, you know, a marketing initiative that we're planning to do. Like they have to be big deal things. And then you also have to follow through on what you say, because if like we did not follow through on the 1 in 100 videos for Void Rivals, if we did not follow through on the 1 in 1,000, you know, virtual visits with Robert, that would have been massively disappointed, and that would have hurt the success of the following calls that we did.
Are those, what are the 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000? Were those like incentive calls?
Yeah, they were.
What?
We did a non-traditional incentive program for Void Rivals, and that was literally all Robert, because he's a champion of retailer and he's amazing. And so for every 100 copies, or for if you ordered 100 copies as a retailer, we would produce a 30-second promo for your store. And it was like 3/4 of the way scripted, where Robert would say like, welcome to the Energon Universe. And it would go through all of that. And then he would say like the store, he's like, I'm glad you're buying your comics at like Acme Comics in North Carolina. And then he would go on and talk about what the Energon Universe was. And it was an evergreen promo ad for that store with like, subscribe to Void Rivals today. But like we didn't give away the secret in the ad, or it was like more or less like, you know, if you've seen it, don't spoil it for anybody. So it was like a really fun way to do that. But we did like 200 of those videos. It was a long day for everybody working in-house and producing those. And then if retailers ordered 1,000 copies of Void Rivals, they would have a virtual visit with Robert, like a virtual store event. And so we've been running those, and they've been like an hour long, and like fans can ask questions of Robert across all of his titles. You can ask questions about the Energon Universe, you know, without spoiling anything. But it's been really good to engage with retailers, and it was an interesting opportunity to do.
That is a really outside the box idea. I don't know if I've ever heard of actual incentives not tied to covers.
Mm-hmm.
It was a good idea.
It was a good idea.
It is funny, though. You mentioned like kind of like collectors and the kind of their position in like 2020 and everything like that. And in like the boom during like 2020, 2021, 2022 with like all the covers and everything like that. I do think one of the things that's interesting, well, it was like the Cliff Chang cover and like the varying people who worked on like the Transformers covers, like the Junie Ba one, for example. Are those open order or are those incentives?
We do have incentive covers on the Energon Universe titles, and we do incentive titles on more books now. And part of that is because Transformers and G.I. Joe are so collectible.
Yeah.
It makes sense to kind of combine that. But, something that we always try to do at Skybound is be cognizant. Again, do something with purpose. So if we're going to offer a 1 in 100 variant, it better be good. And it better be by somebody that's going to be like super exciting to have a 1 in 100 that a retailer is going to want to spend that money on compared to something else. And then it's also like a lot of thought process goes into the programming of that. Is there a set that we can do with these particular variant covers? Like Jason Howard is doing all of our second printings on a lot of those books. And so he's doing those like character spotlights. And so that becomes a collectible program for folks as well. And, we try to be creative with it, but we try to not to be predatory at the same time. Like want to make sure that it's, again, like I said, like you do it with purpose. We're not willy-nilly over here.
That was my big question is like, collectors and speculators are, I mean, depending on who you ask, not as big of a deal as they were 2 years ago.
Sure. Yeah.
But it seems like it's important to work collectors and speculators into your approach without losing track of the recurring customer. It's like trying to find a nice balance between those two sides.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I always try to keep a realistic look at the industry where, you do have to service readers and readership, which is probably like more closer to like 45% of the general market. And then collectors are still a significant part of it. Like you still see a lot of it get moved by certain artists that are hot in the collector space, and what cover price is doing really helps drive sales and like interest on certain books. It's interesting to kind of play both sides, but at the same time, like be genuine to the fan base. And it goes kind of back to our conversation about like engaging with those fans like Clementine and all of that. Are the variants going to make Transformers fans that aren't necessarily comics collectors want to collect all of the different books? And so that's kind of where our thinking comes into of like, we're not necessarily trying to service collector bait, but we are trying to service a collector community that has 40 years of history of collecting toys and merch and going to see movies and they have their guy.
Yeah.
So we'll make sure we service them and their guy.
Yeah. Where's my jazz? Give me some jazz. I love jazz. Jazz is my guy. Okay. So to close, I actually want to talk about a couple broader industry things. You especially now operate in the comics marketing space in a broader sense. You always did because you were dealing with retail, which is just direct marketing. And it's an interesting one to me as someone who works in marketing myself, albeit not in comics, coming from a marketing position. I work in an advertising agency. And so looking at a lot of the comics marketing stuff can be maddening, or it can be exciting in a variety of ways. But lately, it's kind of felt like most marketing efforts just aren't really hitting, with a very, very significant exception of the Energon Universe. I wanted to get a professional take on this subject because, besides having a real budget, what's missing from the approach to comics marketing today? Like, do you think that there are levers that aren't being pulled these days that should be? Or do you think it's just there's a lot of competition out there and it can be tough to like make headway on that?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is that North American comics specifically is oversaturated, and whether that be from the number of titles that are being put out to the number of variant covers that are put out, you have to think about it that comic shops only have a finite amount of space and a finite amount of capital to be able to spend. So they're just basically putting money from the left pocket into the right pocket. They're not really like pulling it anywhere else.
And there's the time factor, just like being aware of it.
Exactly. And so there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of different communications. Like retailers are receiving hundreds of emails every week from publishers being like, this thing is so cool, please order it for your store. And so like comics have like no marketing budget whatsoever, like zero in most cases. You kind of have to pull the free levers that you can. So it is having like engaging social media. It is coming up with things like a 1 in 100 video incentive. It's coming up with like virtual visits. Not everything can be solved by variant covers. And I think that that's something that a lot of folks need to kind of readjust their thinking. And also the fact that we don't have like sales data in regards to sales orders of what the market actually is looking like right now, as opposed to, or sell-through data at all in the direct market, really kind of doesn't help, because if you had that data, it would be able to help influence your strategy more. Because if you see that like, oh, Batman isn't selling what it did 3 years ago when Comic-Con, is no longer able to report on the diamond numbers. That helps adjust everyone's thinking in regards of like, well, do we need to adjust our goals internally? Does this need to be a 75K launch book, or is it actually more realistically going to be a 35K launch book? And then what does that look like long term?
Right.
And how does that adjust our marketing strategy? How creative do we need to get as well?
Because that's part of the tricky thing, right? And you mentioned this earlier, is like a lot of the job, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's easier to sell number one. It's harder to sell 2, a 3, a 4, a 5. And that's true for Dark Ride. That's true for Daniel Warren Johnson's Transformers. And I imagine a big part of your job isn't just like, how do you sell the sizzle of a number one? It's like, how do you keep those people? How do you keep shops from dropping their orders past one and like making it possible so everyone can succeed together?
Yeah. And I think, a lot of that has to do with, really trying to find ways to make the book interesting. Like in my FOC communications with retailers, I do try to be like, I really love this book. And if you don't get it, like I will come find you. Like I love Arcade Kings. So like, I'm very much like, hey, Omni-Man's going to be in Mortal Kombat 1. Also Invincible Season 2 is coming up. A lot of people are going to be wanting to know what the next big thing is. Oh, also the Scott Pilgrim anime is coming on Netflix. Like these are all great comp titles that you can instantly resell this book to when they come in looking for those titles. So that's kind of my approach to it, as opposed to just throwing the solicitation copy up on there and being like, it's cool, and giving them comp titles to be able to like figure what it's going to sell in their store. Because like if I can put a personality behind the book and be able to like tell you why I like it, maybe it will connect with you on a different level. And then nobody is going to sell the book better than the creator too. So if publishers are engaged with the creators and the creators are engaged with the publisher and they're helping to create content and awareness for the book, like that's something that Joshua Williamson does really well. I think on his socials, he's constantly talking about his books and FOC and initial orders and stuff like that. Daniel Warren Johnson's the same way, where he's like, look at this cool Transformer I drew. Oh, by the way, Transformers is coming out. Like, like that kind of stuff is really cool. But like what Skybound does that's really interesting is that we do actually bring the creators in-house to do filming with them, to talk about their books. We had James Tynan the fourth come in as well to do like some Dracula stuff. And we put that forth out as like our trailer for the book of just him talking about it, because no one's going to sell it better than James. Mm-hmm. And then we get them engaged with other partners. We get them engaged with retailers at shows like Comics Pro and with librarians at ALA, with booksellers at ABA. Like we get them involved and get them talking to people.
I do like that part of your FOC approach involves minor threats in their direction. It's always good to do, just to make sure that they know that you mean business.
I do. Top of all of my retailer calls, I'm like, y'all all signed these forms where your shops are.
I did want to say that, like, I think that the idea of like you were talking about with like Energon Universe and how it's like, it was a big secret, but you told them it was a big secret. And to some degree, I imagine a lot of retailers in their mind were like, oh, great, it's another publisher just saying, I got a big deal thing. You got to pay attention to this. I'm like, I've heard that like 40 times in the last week. Mm-hmm. I imagine part of the job of being a comics marketer is you can't always say that this is the biggest thing that's ever happened, because it's just going to fall on deaf ears. You have to angle it in a way that makes it appealing for what it is.
Yeah, I would say that. Because I always, a book is big when it starts to be like everybody's comp title. And it's like, well, if everything is something's killing the children, nothing is something's killing the children. Like, that's kind of my approach to it. So like, I'm very conscious about when I'm doing, my comparative titles for books and making sure that we're not using the same book over and over and over again. And then like, if we're talking about a specific variant cover program, like what's different about this program? I think in like one of my FOC emails for the like 5 versions of the second printing that we had on a certain book, I was like, you don't have to get all of them. Choose your own adventure. Like, we're making them all open to order to keep it simple. And again, it goes back to keeping it simple for folks as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question or observation.
It does. I mean, it's like, for example, I was just reading the Boom series, Damn Them All, which is a really great comic. And I went to go find out when volume 2 was coming out. And the comp that they used for it in like the kind of sub-headline information wasn't a comic at all. It was for fans of films of Guy Ritchie. And I was very surprised by that. Like, to some degree, I'm like, I don't know if that totally fits because this involves demons and magic and all this stuff. But I'm like, I imagined if Guy Ritchie did do something involving demons and magic, it probably would be kind of like this. But it's tough.
I have a whole philosophy on comp titles, but I know we don't have any time for that. So the short version of it is like, yeah, that can work, but it just depends on the audience you're talking to. Like
Yeah.
the comps that the creator is going to give the editor to sell the book to them so it gets greenlit is going to be completely different than the like elevator pitch that we're going to get as a brand team to be like, okay, how do we build out this marketing plan? And then actually build out the comp titles of like, what is actually going to sell? What are the formats that are going to be used for this? Are these direct market comps or are these book market comps? Can we actually be able to talk to librarians about this? Are they going to know what this book is? Do we need to comp this to a novel? And then we can turn around and do things and bring comps back into the limelight because like you can't use comps that are more than 5 years old for the most part because it's dead. But then you have things like the Scott Pilgrim anime that revitalize the sales, all those graphic novels. So now it becomes a viable comp again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's art and science, but like it's a lot of witchcraft too.
I'm terrible at it. There's this comic I really like that Image did called Hexagon Bridge, and I comp it with like Fumito Ueda's games, like he does Eco and stuff like that. And I'm just like 5 people are going to know what I'm talking about. I'm like, I don't care. I'm not a marketer. It's not my job. Okay, last question. I did want to end on a positive note. We're always talking concerns. There's always doom and gloom in the direct market. What is the thing that has you most excited about the direct market and comics right now? Is there something in specific, and you can't say manga?
No, no. So I think we're seeing a lot more folks who are not normal comics people discovering comics, whether that be like North American comics. Now, whether that be through what DC is doing with, like the Raven series brought in a lot of people. It's like what Webtoons is doing with Rachel Smythe's Lore Olympus. Like that's bringing in new people. We're seeing comics hit the mainstream in a way that is so amazing and heartfelt and genuine. Like to have Nimona on Netflix after that book has been out for like what 13 years or something like it's crazy. But to see that book get revitalized and like completely bring ND back into like the comic space, and then those people are going to be like, well, what else can I read? And it's the same thing with like Heartstopper, like that being on Netflix like changed the game for folks. So I think we're seeing this renaissance of new readership, and it truly is readership. It's not collectors, it's readership, because you have younger readers who are trying to find a way into comics, and parents are actually okay with the idea of comics being a valued part of reading. It's like, well, at least they're reading, because like back when I was a kid, like my parents weren't like this, but a lot of parents were like, well, it's comics, that's not real books. And it's like, well, it's visual literacy. It helped me learn how to read a book. Like right. It helped me understand. I have reading comprehension issues. Why do you think I went to art school and I'm not a scientist? Like, I can't read long text. And so that's kind of what gets me excited, is that we're seeing readership, and manga is related to that. Yeah. Manga is helping a big part of that. But, Webtoons is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and publishers are making really creative choices with the creative teams that they're working on and how those books are presented. And I do think now that like manga are viable comps for books, depending on the title. Use them sparingly because those numbers are insane. But like, yeah.
Yeah. I do think it's funny. There is a comic that was the source material for apparently the most popular show on Netflix, Bodies. And it is a Cy Spencer, and I'm trying to remember who else was on it. I want to say it was like Pula Lote and some other people.
Oh, wow.
It was like a Vertigo book. I could be completely wrong on the artist, but I know it was Cy Spencer. I actually didn't know the comic or the show existed until Bruno Batista from Big Bang Comics asked me if he's like, are you watching this? I was like, I don't know what that is. And he's like, it's the hottest thing. And then I found out that apparently the book was out of print. And so DC brought it back in print. And then apparently it instantaneously sold out because people wanted it. And that is, I mean, like, I think a lot of times people talk about like how there can be a purist view of it where it's like, you should like the comic for the comic. But sometimes, sure, like with anime, it can be a guide to the comic. And like, that's really powerful. Don't
yuck anybody's yum on how they get into comics. Just let them be fans of something and let them into the space. Like, don't gatekeep comics. We're selling funny books. We're reading funny books. Just we're having fun here, guys. Like it's at the end of the day, it's like we're talking about Transformers. Like my job most of the time is Transformers and G.I. Joe and Invincible. Like it ain't nothing serious. Like
I love it. Well, you're doing a really good job of having fun and being serious on the job. But Morgan, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about the Energon Universe, your entire life story, and everything else. Yu-Gi-Oh! I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much. Like, I'm a huge fan of this, so thank you so much. It was an honor.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Skybound's brand manager, Editorial Morgan Perry. You can find her on Twitter at Gota, which is spelled Geauxta. Shouts to Deanna Chapman for once again stepping in and editing this podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support it by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Alan Ellsworth, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Kenny Myers, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Mike Cancel, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polgis, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hull, Chris Dorey, Near Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratamps, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peach, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Brent Darb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Pola, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stefan Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Chris Fatah, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Achilles, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Braldy, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Nian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out both their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.